All right, as I said, I'm going to kind of give a fairly brief overview of the different areas of training for track and field. And I'm going to start talking a little bit about middle distance. I'm going to focus probably a little bit more on middle distance, partly because I'm more familiar with that. I would say the biggest difference when it comes to training between middle distance and distance is because the race is just different when you're talking about a 5K, 8K, 10K, half marathon, which is basically anything longer than the mile. I kind of consider distance. I mean, in high school, you consider the mile a distance event too. So, there's a little bit of overlap there, but the biggest thing is it's just in some ways a little bit simpler when you're doing distance because you really only have to focus on running a pace for a longer amount of time. So there's still all the parts there, but you probably spend just a lot more of your time focusing on the cardiovascular training for those distance events, or the term that is more commonly used is just mileage. If you want to be a good miler or a good marathon runner, what you work your way up to is running for a long time. And, that doesn't mean that the interval training isn't a part of it. It is, but the focus is much more on the cardiovascular. So, not to get too much into that, but what I'm going to talk about here is just kind of, in my mind, what the basics are of middle distance and distance training. And when I first started coaching in college, I did all of the middle distance training plans. And a resource that I used was this book. It's by Jack Daniels, which is pretty funny because, it's not the guy who makes the whiskey. It's a distance running guru. And he's been around for a long time. He's probably 75, 80 years old now. But he wrote this book, and really, I think the great thing about it is he had a system that worked very well for training middle distance especially, but it can be applied to distance also. And so the areas that he focuses on, and I really think these are the main basic areas for training middle distance, and really there's a lot of similarities to sprint training also, but obviously the focus is different in sprint training because it's on speed. But long sprinters especially, it's kind of the same areas that you're training. It's just a little bit different, and I'll get into that when I talk about the sprints. But Daniels breaks it down into 4 different areas, and he calls it marathon, threshold, interval, and reps. And I'm going to just really quickly talk about what each of them really means. Marathon pace training is just basically cardio training. And cardio training is, everybody knows what it is. It's just going out and running miles. In a lot of ways, it doesn't really matter what pace you run. It generally is, a fairly slow pace. I have heard experienced distance coaches, complain about athletes running their mileage too slow. So I do think that there's some benefits to running it a little bit faster. But the main concept is just training your cardiovascular system and making it more efficient. And the way you do that is just to go out and run for a long time. And that's basically what it is. I even heard a coach one time say doing a long walk is even effective. I don't know about that, but at the end of the day, the basic idea is just you're running for as long a period of time as you can. And again, I touched on this in the earlier video, but it's cumulative. So obviously a middle schooler or a high schooler is not going to run the same amount of time that a college athlete or a professional athlete is. You work your way up. But I think any of you who have any familiarity with distance running know that, mileage is the thing, right? And the reason why is because mileage trains your cardiovascular system, makes it more efficient. So that's what we're talking about, the efficiency of your cardiovascular system. And if we're getting into the physiology, what we're talking about is how efficiently you get oxygen to your muscles and nutrients and all that type of thing. All right, the second area is threshold, and this is just really short for anaerobic threshold. That's kind of a buzzword for training, and really what that has to do with is endurance. So you're creating endurance in the athlete, and the way you do that is just what it sounds like. You get the athlete to the anaerobic threshold, which is as close to you can, to the point where training becomes aerobic versus anaerobic. And again, I don't want to get too technical here, but just to make sure we know what we're talking about, that's anaerobic is when you can no longer replace the oxygen you're using. So basically, when you're on the anaerobic threshold, you're as close to that point as you can get and continue to run. So it's a fast-paced distance type of workout. You can do this with either with intervals or with continuous running. The intervals, of course, are going to be longer, like 1,000 to a mile, probably in that neighborhood. I know those of you who run cross country, this would be like the Predator run, or a threshold run. Your coaches might have used both types of terms, but it's like running a mile, maybe even two, at a fairly fast pace. That's going to get you close to that anaerobic threshold. And then there's also interval training. This is in Jack Daniels, he calls it VO2 max, or what he considers is VO2 max training. And the VO2 max training is just what it sounds like. It increases your VO2 max. And again, I'm not going to get too much into the physiology, but VO2 max is again about efficiency, and it's the efficiency of your body using oxygen. And the higher your VO2 max, the better you're going to be basically at running any kind of middle distance to distance race. So these would be, again, intervals. The VO2 max intervals, I think, are typically, probably thinking back to when I did that type of training, the stuff that's between probably 600 to 1,200 meters. So the 1,000 repeats that you middle distance and distance runners are used to doing, those are really VO2 max types of workouts with a fairly short recovery. And that would be a big difference from threshold. With threshold, you're either doing one continuous run or you're doing some shorter runs where you might, or like 1,000 where you might take a little bit of a break between. With a VO2 max, your recovery might be a couple minutes or 90 seconds, and sometimes even a jogging recovery. You're going to keep that heart rate up there and really, really train the oxygen uptake. And then the last one in the Daniels formula is reps, which is just speed and economy. So basically you're talking about race pace intervals, sprint intervals. Some of you have done wickets before, which is basically a max velocity type of run where you go over many hurdles, which helps improve your running technique. So when you get into reps, that's really what you're focusing on. For the distance runner, you're trying to improve speed. Of course, you always want to be fast in track and field. But the focus is also, on technique. So you're trying to improve the efficiency of the run. So there's a focus on running form. Coaches will want you to focus on that. and sprints. So there'll be some fast stuff, even max velocity for middle distance, but a lot of the middle distance stuff will also be like race pace. So you're trying to run at the pace that you're going to race. Okay, I don't want this video to get too long, but that's kind of what I wanted to cover there. Those are the areas that you want to focus on training for middle distance and distance.